Welcome to the 229th edition of Europe Calling, today in cooperation with the New Climate Institute. I'm Maximilian and I'm the Managing Director of Europe Calling, and I'll be moderating this meeting. I'd like to particularly welcome today's panelists, and I shall introduce them in a minute. But first, a few technical messages. We will mainly be speaking German today. To allow our English-speaking guests to follow us, we have two interpreters with us again today, and you can select your preferred language.
229th webinar of Europe Calling, and we will speak mostly German today, so if you need help with that, you can find the interpretation function under the little globe in the control panel, where you just choose English. Dann wieder zurück auf Deutsch.
And as always, with Europe Calling, you can ask your questions and rate the questions of others. We use Slido for this. You can see the link in the chat in a moment, and you should feel free to ask your questions there and rate the questions of others. This is the only way we can ask the questions that are of interest to you with 1,200 registrations. And very importantly, please add your name. It's so much nicer if I don't have to refer constantly to a question from an anonymous user. Of course, you can ask questions in English and in German. And as always, you can later on listen to the webinar again. We are on YouTube and available live as a podcast. That was the housekeeping. Now to the topic of this webinar. You have probably the same experience as I do. You may have heard it one way or another, whether in the media, among colleagues or family. In view of the major geopolitical crisis, there is no more time for climate action. It just disturbs foreign policy, where other topics are more important right now. This can also be seen in the polls and the election results. I compared the results of the elections in 2021, and I worked it out what the results were, because I think it's really quite telling for this meeting. And I now have a little problem with uploading my slide. Here you can see the comparison between the federal elections 2021 and 2025. And the question was asked, what is your main concern? And in the 21 election, that the topic of climate protection was still very prominent. However, nowadays it's only important for 13%. And if you look at the share of the more progressive parties, and the Green Party, the Left, and the Social Democrats, this concern about climate policy has diminished. And that is why I'm particularly happy that the New Climate Institute and the team said that we could cooperate in this webinar, and that we should approach the question from the other side, and perhaps raise the question, is it really just an annoyance, the climate policy? Is it optional? Or can perhaps the climate policy together with foreign policy achieve much more, like protect the climate, make the world fairer, and secure political and economic interests? In other words, a triple win. For that, to answer that question, Ines, Paiva, and Lukas Kahlen will provide us with an analysis of the proposals for the coalition agreement of the new federal government. And then we will hear from two acclaimed political experts, Imme Scholz, president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin, and she was 30 years also active in the German Institute for Development Policy, and Claudia Detsch, who is the head of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation Competence Center for Climate and Social Justice in Brussels, and she was responsible for the EPD journal. And for those of you who are not aware what the foundations stand for, I would like to clarify that they are very closely tied to the Bündnis 90 Greens party and the SPD party. And in present day lingo, you would probably call them the party's think tanks, which means that these two were still together in the coalition government until February, where foreign climate policy was primarily crafted by the Green Foreign Ministry of Annalena Baerbock. In the new federal government, however, the Greens are now in the opposition, and the SPD is a small partner in the coalition government and now has the responsibility for international climate policy in the Environment and Climate Ministry of Carsten Schneider. I am very happy that we cooperate in this webinar because we're confronted with times where everything changes, and perhaps the climate policy actors need to really stand closer together. And we also invited the third foundation in the group, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the CDU think tank, but due to a reorganization, they weren't able to join us here tonight. That was my introduction. I think I should now hand over to Ines and Lukas for their presentation, and I would like to thank both of them upfront for the excellent cooperation.
Thank you, Max. And I hope you can all hear me. Yes, hello, everyone. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you to Europe Calling for this very interesting and relevant topic and the opportunity to talk to it. So we've also studied the climate policy and foreign policy of this new government, and would like to discuss it with you. Let me introduce NewClimate. We are a think tank, a German think tank, on climate policy and global sustainability. We're a non-profit GmbH working on a project basis. And this report that we're presenting today was financed by the European Climate Foundation. So we've got some slides for you, a presentation that we're hoping to show.
Heute soll es die internationale Klimapolitik der Bundesregierung
gehen. So we want to talk about the international climate policy under the new federal government. So a new direction for priorities in foreign policy. This is a good goal. And Max also mentioned the many crises, wars, climate change, and geopolitical tensions that we're living. And international, there are great changes, and alliances are shifting. Long-standing alliances are shifting. And against that backdrop, the EU and Germany need a new strategic orientation in their foreign policy. So we want global strengthening, but also with a view to climate policy, secure the transformation to climate neutrality. And for Germany, international climate cooperation is a necessity, not just because of our historic responsibility. That's of course there as well. So before we go into the details, we just wanted to show some figures, facts and figures, to illustrate what we've just said. So we know that exports are very important for the German economy. Everyone knows that. So we've got some figures for you. The export quota, Germany's export quota, is 50% of our BIP. So every second euro that's made in Germany is earned by doing business abroad. In terms of jobs, that means that every second job depends on export activities in Germany. And then every fourth job, excuse me. Then another area, the topic of transformation and how it progresses globally. It's too slow, but there are some changes. Some examples, we have renewable energies that are less expensive now and more competitive with other activity. Then e-mobility, a clear trend, electric cars, definitely a sales increase. Constant increase, and combustion engines are losing market share, especially in Europe. So these are trends and developments that are visible and can be measured. And the third area, dependence on raw materials for key sectors and key industries. Again, it's very clear, and I think it's nothing new, that Germany does not have a wealth of its own raw materials, so we're dependent on importing them. Just to give an example of global copper reserves, only 6% of them can be found in Europe, and the rest, the lion's share, is abroad. Another raw material that's very important for Germany, copper is very important for building cars, machinery, etc. So most of these raw materials can be found in a few countries, like China, for instance, supplies 80% of critical raw materials and is one of the top exporters in the world. So these trends taken together show how important partnerships with other countries are for Germany and our export-oriented economy. That was just to give you a framework of facts and figures for this presentation. So on partnerships, looking at these trends, it's important to remember that there is global competition for strategic partnerships with other countries. And so we're in competition with these countries, also countries in the global south, and they now have a position of strength because they do have the potential for renewable energies, critical raw materials, and growing export markets. So this is important for Germany, and the classic donor and receiver relationship that we used to have is no longer a fact. So there are other actors now, China, on top of everyone else, are also investing in countries, for instance, in the global south. So they're increasing their influence, and Germany is in competition with these countries. So you have to make your offer more attractive in order to succeed and make your economy future-proof. So against this backdrop, and Max has already mentioned it, we've analyzed the coalition agreement between the three parties in government now. And before my colleague Ines will introduce some specific recommendations and introduce some details of the coalition agreement, let's look at the positive points that we've seen in this agreement. So, coherent foreign policy, that's one of the goals for the government, this coalition, and that's of course a good goal. We've got this slide from a study that we've published 2022. You don't have to read the details, but we just had a look at the activities of various ministries in their partner countries, and the darker the color of a country, the more German ministries are active in this country. So there are quite a few countries where we have at least 5 German ministries being active. which is a lot.
Wenn wir uns da noch vergegenwärtigen,
So,
dass die EU und ihre Mitgliedstaaten
also
ebenfalls
remembering the fact that the EU and member states are also active in many, many countries, it's clear that we need a coordinated and coherent foreign policy.
Zweite Bereich,
then there's another area that was underlined in the coalition agreement, namely the improvement of the interministerial coordination. And we agree with that and have also introduced a slide because of that. The same study, taken from the same study, 2022. This is just an overview of the competent authorities and ministries that represent Germany abroad. And on the left-hand side, you can see the ministries, there are ministries, and on the right-hand side in orange or red, the different formats, UN, EU, developed banks, etc. So it's a bit of a mess, but just an attempt to visualize how important a coordinated approach is. Again, keeping in mind that the EU is supposed to speak with one voice. So we don't want this type of spaghetti diagram. But German authorities should also act in coordination with the EU. It's difficult, but it's very important. And of course, another positive factor is the fact that the federal government wants long-term partnerships with the countries in the global south, which is a strong, important signal to their partner countries that we want a reliable relationship and that Germany is a reliable partner to make plans with. Another legitimate, important point is that Germany's ambition is to communicate its own interests very clearly. We haven't been that transparent in the past, but if the coalition agreement's goals are implemented, this will also further trust and enhance stable cooperation. Another couple of points on cooperation with the EU, which is an important factor in our opinion. So, trying to strengthen the EU's role as a geopolitical actor, but also coordinate our own partnerships with the EU, but specifically with the EU Global Gateway, to make sure that we're working in the same, that we're all on the same page. So these are the positive parts. Now looking at the foreign policy objectives and international climate policy that could help, that's going to be Ines' part. Ines, thank you, Lukas, for this overview. So let's take a look at international climate policy and how it can make a contribution to reaching our climate policy goals. So international climate policy, an international lever of the German foreign policy, that's the study that we published yesterday. We have 5 key areas which were named in the coalition agreement: strategic partnerships, strengthening multilateralism, reduce dependencies, promote economy and export location, and integrate climate as a part of the security policy. Let's start with the strategic partnerships. The government has said that they want to deepen and expand their partnerships, especially with the global south. Lukas said it that we are in competition with other countries for these partnerships. Climate neutral value chains and a lever to make German cities offer more attractive. So climate neutrality should be the basis, should form the basis of new partnerships with the global south, rather than just focusing on our one-sided interests like fighting migration or securing access to raw materials. The new North-South Commission could be a strategic platform in order to identify and define potential fields of cooperation. In our policy brief, we have a short list of do's and don'ts, and for governance, we need a closer cooperation between the EU institutions and the member states in order to strengthen credibility and effectiveness of EU initiatives, especially with a view to the trade and investment partnerships that the EU has, and also the area of critical raw materials. Let's stay on the geopolitical level. The government has said that they want to strengthen multilateral structures, and climate policy can play an important role by anchoring climate neutrality as a pillar of global stability in order to increase faith and trust with the countries of the Global South, which would also correspond to the interests of the new government, because it would show that we are a reliable partner and it could strengthen a role as a leader. Then a dialogue with emerging economies like Mexico and Brazil in order to exchange on their priorities and identify areas of cooperation in order to find a just way to decarbonize. Then countries that have left multilateral institutions have left gaps, and Germany could fill these gaps with plurilateral initiatives in order to engage more in the just energy transition partnerships or climate goal. So it's important for Germany to take this seriously and find a common answer, especially decarbonization, because we need credibility, cooperation, and strengthen multilateral reforms. And then reaching our own climate goals will also strengthen Germany's and the EU's credibility on multilateral forums. If we have a strong voice and one voice, if we want to have this, we need a stronger and better cooperation between the EU and its member states, especially, and also Germany. So in terms of economic dependencies and value chains, the government has clear goals. The competitiveness in Germany will depend on the clear will to make attractive offers, local value creation and sustainable value creation in the area of critical raw materials and green hydrogen. And we have to decarbonize our own economy and need a clean technology. That's very important. And Germany has to use this opportunity to reduce its dependencies on autocratic regimes and further local development. As I've said, critical raw material supply has to be diversified, so we need attractive offers for strengthening local value creation, but also to implement environmental standards and social standards and have a knowledge transfer between our partners. And so that means that we have to promote national and European coordination and between the partner countries, and that means the Ministry of Economy, between the Ministry and the Environment and the EU. We have to coordinate better, work with the EU Commission and the EAD, the EAS, in order to also work on topics like critical raw materials. This government has said that Germany should continue to be a strong export location, and the government recognizes how important climate-friendly lead markets are, but this could be used more strongly in a strategic way. So we need especially economic strategies for global transformation processes and strengthen international cooperation by way of market access, exporting green technologies, and research and innovation partnerships with the Global South. This way, the necessary resilience and competitiveness of Germany can be strengthened, and it can be made future-proof. We will have further economic risks if the government does not take this serious, the transformation to go towards climate neutrality, and doesn't implement this. So the one-stop shop for external economic support and development cooperation was announced electrons. That could be an important point for a closer interplay between the German economy and the partnerships for knowledge transfer, etc. So we need a new integrated interaction between foreign and security development policy. That's thinking about climate risk from a security process. So the concept of human security beyond state security, that's important for understanding also the risks that we have because of the climate risks. Climate change multiplies risk, especially in situations where we already have humanitarian crises and conflicts. So climate risks have to be taken into consideration at the global level, and that's of particular importance. So we have to promote the resilience of vulnerable states. That means the new government should participate actively in financing loss and damage and climate adaptation. In terms of energy security, Germany needs to reduce fossil fuel dependencies and autocratic regimes in order, for instance, to, by the way of strengthen our own renewable energies and establish partnerships with like-minded democracies. We need an integrated security approach in strong coordination between all relevant ministries, like the BMUKN, the Chancellor's Office, the Foreign Policy Office, and the DMFS. The new Security Council could also strengthen this integration of climate risks.
Ja, genau. Ich übernehme noch mal ganz kurz, bevor wir das Wort dann auch weitergeben.
So let me take over before the other participants will take the floor, the other speakers. This is just a brief summary of what Germany can achieve with an integrated climate foreign policies. I'm not going to read it all out. It's just a summary of the arguments that were read out just now. And we can talk about this in more detail a bit later. So now we want to take a look at the coalition agreement itself, and that's going to be our last slide then. We've talked about the positive parts of this agreement, and now we want to mention some parts that we would criticize and that create doubts in terms of the potential that we've described, whether that will actually be achieved and whether the government is actually looking to implement this. So in total, there isn't a clear strategy for international climate policy and partnerships in this coalition agreement. There are no clear descriptions of this. One sign is the fact that in the draft coalition agreement, Working Group 12, international energy and climate policy was still identified as an integral part, an important part of foreign policy. But in the final coalition agreement, that line had been deleted. So it's a little bit of a signal to Germany's partners and what our priorities are. So climate isn't a priority in the development policy, so in the chapter on development cooperation, and it's not really part of the chapters on strengthening national economic and security interests. So we would say in the face of this economic transformation, this is actually negligent to neglect the climate like this. So there are different areas in development cooperation where the coalition agreement focuses on one-sided interests rather than tackling the root causes. So it's more just about access to raw materials, and that's not going to convince potential partners. And these partner countries now have a selection of possible partners, so they're going to be choosing and selecting those partners who take them seriously. So that could be problematic. And then I would like to point out that we should interact with these partners at eye level and see climate policy as a geopolitical instrument and use it thus. So that was our view, and we're looking forward to your comments.
Ja, super, vielen Dank euch auch perfekt in der Zeit. Well done und das zu zweit. Ich habe zwei Rückfragen hier.
Thank you very much. I have two reactions already.
Wir haben ja schon 20 Fragen.
We already have 20 questions via the Slido tool. Susanne asks whether you could briefly explain what the EU Global Gateway is. That's one of the questions. And the other question concerns the map that you showed earlier on. What are the criteria for these activities? Those are the two questions to you. Yes, I'll start. The Global Gateway is a program where the EU bundles its activity with partner countries, bilateral partnerships or Team Europe initiatives. So it's a bundling of initiatives that were there already in the past, but then they were summarized under the Global Gateway somehow. It's a form of rebranding, really, a rebranding of activities of the European Union in partner countries. And the other question regarding the map, those activities are official activities that a ministry initiated with a country X. Thanks very much. Those were the questions for clarification. And I would now like to pass the floor to Claudia Detsch of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. We've already introduced her, and she is the head of the FES Competence Center in Brussels for climate change and social justice, and I'm sure she'll have plenty of comments on what we've just heard. We look forward to hearing you. Yes, thank you very much and good evening. Thank you for having invited me to be part of the panel and to discuss this very important and fascinating paper. I have prepared a small presentation. Don't worry. It will not be a counter presentation. It just helps me structure my presentation. First of all, and very much by ways of principle, I was really very grateful for what Max said at the beginning of this webinar. I think we're all slightly concerned about the fact that the climate policy does not seem to have the same appreciation or importance any longer for people out there as it did have it about 4 or 5 years ago. It's a bit of a green lash that we're experiencing. And a climate policy in itself does have a value in itself. I do think it does make all the difference, whether we have a temperature going up by 1.7% degrees or 4 degrees, really does make a difference. So it has a value in itself. But it is also very valuable in many other areas of life. And as we face so many different challenges and people are so concerned about what's going on around them, I think that you will probably have to reach out to these people in other fields of life or walks of life, perhaps not only in the climate policy, but via their jobs, for example, via the discussion about the labor market. What will be the good jobs in 10 to 15 years? What will make all the difference in our competitiveness? Because for sure, we will have to adapt in the labor market. You talked about resilience, and that is really a big question. Somehow similar is the question about international cooperation. That's not just charity. It really is a desire to cooperate with others and to integrate well in the world society and take everyone on board. This is also for us very important personally. Why? Because Lukas said it, we are dependent on certain countries. We will not be able to maintain competitiveness in Europe without actually cooperating very well with those other countries. And I think it needs to be communicated into other groups in society. In Brussels, I think we witness it perhaps much more than in Berlin, because there is a competitiveness agenda underway. And one of the main topics is the elimination of bureaucracy. Or the administrative burden. And it's very much a black and white debate. Everything is being discussed and questions that we did over the past 5 to 10 or 15 years. And definitely, it's always a good idea to reflect on what could be done better for industry and for employers. But we shouldn't perhaps not eliminate everything. High standards, for example, and certain laws, like the one on the supply chain, are instrumental for really improving the quality. We introduced a paper 2 days ago on the cooperation in the area of critical raw materials with a view to Asia, and it definitely is a good idea to have some prominent countries heading those initiatives, and it does make a difference. Prominent countries, meaning Germany and France, for example. You also mentioned a win-win situation, and I think if I look at that, then we need to be clear that we need to submit something very different for these new partnerships that we wish to enter. We will probably have to become really serious about expanding our own production capacities and look at the partner countries. There's always a lot of suspicion around. I worked a lot in Latin America for a few years. Climate and energy, there was always a certain mistrust there. Who's going to supply the raw materials in order to achieve climate neutrality? We will definitely have to make sure that we have our own production capacities, and there's a lot of mistrust here. We always speak about a partnership on equal footing, but that was hardly credible over the past few years, and I think we really need to walk the talk now. And it would also offer job opportunities, definitely, if locally those production capacities were established. The win-win is interesting to look at. I think many countries in the global south have quite a more relaxed view of China. Obviously, they don't want to be fully dependent because the dependency also extends to dependency on technology. And that is something that we could perhaps take up and develop some joint interests. But we also see that the narrative and the prospects for success are extremely closely interlinked with the industrial agenda in Germany and the EU. What does that mean? Well, it does mean that we need to take stock, that we need to look at job security, for example, at competitiveness, and a few of the initiatives that are being discussed nowadays in Brussels and in Berlin actually focus on that. How can we make sure that some new good jobs will actually be established in the green economy? I think we could go on and on discussing this. We should not look at things actually in a too relaxed way. The CBAM is of tremendous importance. It is the mechanism for the carbon border adjustment, and it is important to actually limit the pollution and production must become cleaner. It may probably become much more expensive due to that. And that's one of the reasons why the carbon border adjustment mechanism was introduced in order for those countries moving forward and being more progressive, not suffer from competitiveness disadvantage. But the countries in the global south regard this as a trade barrier, really. And then we need to have a closer look at the revenues that come along with that mechanism. It must obviously be invested in technology upgrades, but many in the global south also tell us that these funds should be used to invest in those countries because they actually suffer from the mechanism. And I think that's legitimate. But money can only be dispersed once. We all know that. But we should be aware of the potential for tensions in this area. The question of the new relationship between the state and the private sector is also needed because we normally proclaim that some new production sites will be built locally and at the level of the government. A lot of declarations were signed off, and I heard, for example, from Chile that quite a lot of promises were made, but then nothing happened. And I think if we look at the raw materials and the processing of raw materials, we probably pursue totally different objectives in the EU as opposed to the countries of the global south. So therefore, I think we have to have a close look. The conservative parties have a bit of a problem with the demand that the government or the state should intervene and steer those processes. But we must all be aware of the fact that building up new production sites take a long time, and obviously it cannot all be done by private companies. Something that I miss a little bit in your paper and also in the debate, that's the recycling and the circular economy. That is something of great importance. I think it's important for the countries of the global south to realize that we want to reduce our material waste. And we are very much advanced in the European Union in this area of circular economy. So perhaps we should underline it much more. You talked about some critical questions. You also mentioned it in your paper. There are countries who wish to decarbonize. It's not so easy to combine that with development. And the idea of development is probably very much in the forefront for these countries because they want to create jobs for young people, for example. And what we will find is that our counter proposals, the fossil industry, for example, they will probably rise because of the rhetoric that we hear now. So we will be called upon to offer some very attractive alternative solutions. There's another point which is very important to me because I always wonder how we can balance it well in Europe. Some countries really want some high standards. National governments, however, sometimes have a different view of it, of that. So this must also be reckoned with in the trade agreements. And you talked about the democratic partnership, so for example. It would be important to also look into the matter of securing energy supply. But when we talk about climate policy, I think it is all the more important to take in lots of countries, to take them on board. That would be preferable, definitely. And I think a very interesting dynamic would develop, and even some authoritarian petrostates might be interested, because there's also the question of green hydrogen, for example. So I think some of these relations could be further developed. And now I turn to my last slide. How about China? Well, the hope definitely was that the EU, together with China, can probably fill the gap that the United States are leaving if they no longer contribute to the climate policy on the international level. However, we're also competitors, EU and China, and that will probably be a huge challenge for the years to come, how we can create or achieve an equilibrium. Looking at all those challenges, we must be aware of the massive production in China. And I think we are advanced as we are in the energy transformation because of this pressure. But at the same time, we need to see how to react to the continued mass production under totally different conditions. And then the question of the reputational benefit or the delusion. During the event that I already mentioned, we noticed that we are very much advanced, and that we have a lot to offer, and that we can, for example, create jobs locally, and we don't send our own workforce there, so we create capacities somewhere else. And I think we should actually do that. And Chinese actors, for example, they would probably adapt to those wishes. I don't know whether it was Max or Lukas who said it, but in actual fact, the partner countries can now choose for the better offer, for the more attractive offer. So other actors will probably follow suit and adapt their offers accordingly. So that would perhaps be quite a good idea, to have more production capacity of a different style. So the question is not so much the where, but the fact that they be constructed. I hope that I wasn't too long.
Das war auf jeden Fall sehr gut, würde ich mal sagen, und hat nochmal ganz viele neue Perspektiven geöffnet. Und ich merke schon, wie im Slido, also du hast so Punkt Recycling zum Beispiel.
That was very good. Lots of new perspectives, and we have some interesting questions in Slido for our discussion later. I'm looking forward to that. But first of all, Imme Scholz, member of the executive board of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and she's worked for many years for the German Development Institute. She's a real expert. So I'm looking forward to her point of view. Imme Scholz. Imme, you have the floor.
Ja, vielen Dank.
So I'm the last speaker, and so I can say that a lot of what I am thinking has already been said. So I'm not going to repeat that. I'm going to mention a couple different details and focus points. So let's start like this. Claudia, you said that the climate is not something to be regarded on its own, but it can be made more attractive, presented as more attractive because it has further benefits, even if your partner isn't completely convinced of the climate, but there are other benefits to it. But at the same time, Ines and Lukas had explained that in the coalition agreement, climate policy wasn't a main focus. It should have been, but it wasn't. So if you're looking at the economic policy, you can keep looking for climate policy in that. So how can we make a credible offer to our partners if we don't have the climate in our own political strategy for energy security? So how can you credibly say that you're going to expand hydrogen if we don't not doing it, if it's not part of the coalition agreement or our own policy? So that's not a great basis for proactive climate foreign policy with the goal of transformation. You create this link between climate and foreign policy and give it the necessary political clout. So we're talking about these objectives that you'd have to implement with our potential partners, but it's not that easy because the partners are very different as well. And in the former coalition, there were a number of partnerships. And again, Claudia mentioned it, we had seen the mistrust, especially in countries exporting raw materials. So mistrust, not just in theory, but they have experienced the difficulties of cooperation between two partners with very different economic and political contexts and framework conditions and structures. So I believe that there are some unanswered questions here. We're all interested in furthering this, of course, but we have this lack of an integrated climate foreign policy, but on top of that, the climate isn't really a credible priority in the main parts of the coalition agreement, and you do need a bit of coherence between domestic policy and foreign policy actions. So that's my one point. And another point, listening to you speak a lot, if you talked about Germany and then also Europe, Lukas and Ines, you said that it's very important to coordinate with the EU, Team Europe, follow that approach and use it. So if we're looking at Team Europe in practical terms, Team Europe isn't really an integrated approach. So you're doing something together, but every member state, of course, will make sure that they're visible as such. So, as far as I've heard from people who are working in the implementation of Team Europe, it is very, very hard to coordinate. So my thoughts on that would be that it's probably not enough to just coordinate. Germany is a major player in the EU, but internationally, globally, Germany as such isn't that an attractive a partner. Looking at raw materials in Chile, you mentioned it, we see the same thing. Germany, also Europe, doesn't have the type of company that's necessary for specific types of corporations, especially in raw materials. China has the better offer. So lithium, for instance, you're looking at countries that are investing here, not just in Latin America, but also in Nigeria. It's China because they have the relevant companies. So we are a relevant economic and a trade partner, but often not the most important. We're also not the most important source for foreign direct investment, because our companies hesitate because of the risks. They're not used to dealing with such risks. And in terms of the most important climate technologies, we're not a producer. And again, it's China. So how to make such a partnership attractive? I believe coordination alone isn't enough. We would need, for this type of partnership and cooperation, you'd have to draw up the concept at the European level from the outset. So you'd have to go up to that level and start designing it in that vein, a European vein, so pooling the European activities. The federal government could, in cooperation with the EU Commission, design a joint initiative with the participation of several member states, pooling their resources, and then also use the EIB, the European Investment Bank, but then also use the European institutions with their larger budget. That, of course, is very ambitious, and you might say it's not very realistic, but Europe, against the geopolitical backdrop that we have today, has to do more. And we always say Europe has to be strengthened and use its potential better to be a weightier partner at the international level. And that could be achieved by acting in a more integrated way. And that way, you could connect this climate foreign policy with trade policy, because that is a European policy. And then the clean trade and investment partnerships, you mentioned them, and Ursula von der Leyen announced them. They could become a reality this way. And this way, we could also show that the EU is leaving this free trade paradigm in the past, because it's still not connected to a real transformation concept. But the goal isn't just to buy cheaper goods or build supply chains or value chains, but securing competitiveness by lowering parts of our supply chains, by outsourcing part of our supply chains, but then also connecting a trade cooperation with substantial economic improvements and improvements of social standards, with an increased value creation at the local level. And you all said it, that really is a sign of quality for a functioning partnership. It has to be. And that means making decisions. What type of value creation will not be done in Europe in the future? And another thought idea would be triangular cooperations with other countries rather than this integrated European concept. So looking at the strong investors in Africa, for instance, it's the Gulf states and Turkey as well. So the difficult partners for us, of course. But if we can generate a transformation interest with some of these countries and implement it with them, the Gulf states, for instance, know the oil producing ones know that this is not a sustainable way of making business. But of course, there are lots of difficulties there. But that's part of reality. That we're not just focusing on China, but other countries as well, medium-sized countries. There are major investors at this time. So we can't forget these types of competitors, and we have to make sure that we maybe start specific cooperations with them. And then my last point, the North-South Commission. Claudia, you didn't comment on it, but I would like to say, when I read this, I thought, okay. So in the coalition agreement, this North-South Commission is mentioned in connection with the approach to seek a quality improvement for cooperation with the countries of the Global South. But there's no direct link then. And the problem is how quickly will this be implemented and how effective will it be, or how for these partnerships that we really need in any form or shape. And then Lukas and Ines, you said, well, we'll just change it. We'll just make it a transformation agency. That's how I read your bullet points. But that's a very different animal than a commission. So we'll see what happens in reality. We'll see what will happen. Thank you.
Super, vielen Dank. Das waren ja auch noch mal ganz viele
Thank you very much. Can you now hear me better? Because some of you say that my volume is too low. I hope you can hear me well now. I would now like to turn to Lukas and to Ines because some of the comments really were for you. Perhaps you would like to comment. Yes, definitely. Some of the points that were made were extremely important in our short presentation and in the short brief. We were not able to elaborate on everything, but the recycling question that's also been mentioned in the chat should definitely be integrated in the strategy, and it would definitely be good in order to reduce the need. I think Claudia said at the outset that there was a tension perhaps between development and the decarbonization, and perhaps we went about it a bit oversimplistically, but the chat also offered a reference to Senegal, for example. What does it mean if the partners negotiate from a position of strength, but then the fossil resources will be depleted in order to promote their own development, which is exactly what we did over the past 100 years. I think that's a very valid point, and we need to be conscious of it. And the question in the chat was, how would we handle that dilemma? Well, we would certainly take the wish to develop very seriously, and then we would need to communicate that some other aspects need to be considered at the same time, like, for example, decent work and sustainability. And I think it's also a responsibility of Germany to point to the financial risks, to the long-term development, to the assets that will probably be achieved if the market develops the way that we expect it to develop. Some of it may not pay off. So that would be a bargaining opportunity for Germany to show that you can go about it differently, that you could use renewable energy sources in industry. So to summarize briefly, I think that is a way that you could approach that dilemma in the practical negotiation situation. I'm sure you need a lot of diplomacy because it is difficult to move forward in that area. But that would be something that Germany should definitely go for, and the partner countries should be accompanied in this direction. And the other topic that we could discuss is the one of the narratives. Of course, we were conscious of the narratives. We tried to write up this brief, this policy brief, in a constructive way. We simply looked at the priorities that the government set itself, and we said, well, they can be reached, including a climate policy. That was really the objective of the output. But some of the questions also tackled that very question, whether we should always approach it that way. Perhaps not. But we wanted to take up the objectives that were enumerated and look at the combination. Yeah, I would like to come back to that because Claudia also said we need to make those fossil negotiation offers appear less attractive. And the question was put to us on Slido, what do you do with a country like Senegal? There was gas available, gas resources, for example, and Scholz would have liked to opt for the gas, whereas the Greens rather would not. So what do you do then? What would be an offer to the government of Senegal in such a situation? Because this is a very abstract consideration. But in a country like Senegal, how can you convince the government not to exploit gas resources off the coast of Senegal, but to rather develop renewables? How would you go about it? If somebody wishes to answer that, do go ahead. Anyone? How would we concretely win them with our arguments?
Ich kann das schlecht beantworten, das ist mein Kollege.
I think I'm not the right person to answer that. That would be my colleague. Yeah. You all said it. You said that the value chain should be concentrated at in the local situation. And the values must be generated there. So what can Europe offer? Claudia, you also mentioned it. Yeah, well, I think that we need to bring the awareness along. And I think that many of those countries have a two-tongue approach to that. Mexico and Brazil, for example, they do have fossil resources. and they would like to use them and exploit them more extensively. So that's one of the reasons why there is no easy fix to this question. And I think the mix that we use in Europe when we reflect on these issues is where are the jobs? Where is the greater benefit for the economy, for example? Well, it comes with an extension of renewable energy sources. And that's a question that we should put. How many people can work there? But we must also be honest because it's challenging for us ourselves, because particularly the sectors that are coming under pressure now, for example, the coal mining, those people will turn around to us and tell us, but those jobs were excellent jobs, and they have a very strong trade union lobby behind them. So when you create new jobs in the clean economy, then you should make sure that those jobs also be good and well paid and well represented. It's a huge challenge to the trade unions also. They're fully aware of that. So these jobs must at the least be good jobs. And that is also true for the countries of the global south. And that's why nobody can present a magical answer now and a magical solution. If you have those resources and if you have started exploiting them, that's very difficult to go back. I would like to add one thing. I find it extremely difficult if we ourselves move more into gas again. We do have the conflict in our own country because we want to lower the price of energy. And I think the other argument that's being used frequently, if you look at emissions from sub-Saharan African states, they're next to none. And that's a contradiction in terms. Who has a right to pollute is another question. Why do we want to avoid them producing additional pollution? I think any proposals, any suggestions must be hugely convincing. And I think you would really have, with a view to Senegal, develop a very broad economic concept that must be fully convincing, where perhaps some other objectives are worked on, which offer prospect of employment at the local level. Because in the past we only looked at isolated area of industry or the economy. And that's why I said earlier on that it would be much better if Germany concentrated on an integrated program of offering solutions to African countries. And it could even be a broad African initiative, not singling out individual countries. So they could promote EU projects, and they could perhaps form the basis of a development policy even, and that's a possibility to then discuss energy and energy policy. It would be a totally different format, far removed from what can be read in the coalition agreement. And that would perhaps fill the gap of the external climate policy. Before I call on Lukas again, I would like to read the top question to you because it goes in exactly that direction. Gabriel Müller says, I'm speechless how the new government deals with the climate crisis. And it seems to have fallen under the influence of the lobbyists. I would like to connect that with another question. Nord Stream 2 is to be revitalized. More and more SPD members of parliament travel to Baku to discuss about gas and oil with some countries. And that's precisely the question I want to put to Lukas. Did you look at it more in detail? You mentioned it, but if we don't offer anything ourselves, then we can't demand anything from others. Because historically, we would be trapped. Well, of course, at this point that we must lead by example is definitely an eternal rule. And we share that view. And you also mentioned something different. You said we need to achieve positive results and reduce our dependency on gas, for example. But Germany itself finances gas exploitation in Senegal. And that was a debate of proactively using taxpayers' money from Germany to actually produce gas off the shore of Senegal. Coming back to the last question or the previous question that we discussed. And then the topic of leading by example and only being able to request from partner countries what you achieve yourself and what you practice yourself. That is an idea that we definitely share. But we would at least like to be able to enter into an exchange and try and convince these people, these others, that their objectives will be reached more easily if they think of transition, of the green transition and the fair transition. Claudia. Yes. However, I feel that lead by example is also true in other areas. To be able to show that something works economically is important because, first of all, an economy has to be stabilized and we need to generate growth. We lose too many jobs in industry at present, and that destabilizes a country because people don't feel safe about their jobs. They don't feel confident about the future for their children, for example. And I remember that from my time in Latin America. They always look very closely at how the development towards climate neutrality actually works. And the same is true for the energy prices. Energy prices are to be lowered, but a lot of people are very worried about the price hikes. Energy prices doubled almost, and other prices also went up tremendously, and that is of major concern to many people. And of course, we want power, we want a safe power supply, and I don't want to have the gas heating in my home because other forms of heating are probably more economical. So people around us and from other continents do have a look at how things work for us, and they will only be convinced if we can show them that we're moving in the right direction.
Ja.
That's for sure.
Ja, es ist
Yes,
es ist das Ganze von
I
zwei Seiten
know.
betrachtet, oder?
You always have to look at
will gar nicht so viel selber
both
reinkommen.
sides
Wir
of
überlassen es euch lieber und für unseren
the argument.
vielleicht wollt ihr da
I don't
noch
want to
mal
comment too
zu
much.
reingehen.
Perhaps you would
Ich will
like to
das
come
quasi jetzt
in
verbinden, weil wir noch nicht
again,
verbunden
but
haben,
I would like
mit
to
zwei Fragen, die wir auch
combine
relativ
that
viele Stimmen bekommen haben. Felix von
with
Kronen haben wir
another two
diskutiert, und zwar
questions
eine
that
Frage von Wolfgang Leinecker,
got
der
a
fragt,
lot of
sind die
rating.
Hauptinteressen an strategischen
Out of
Partnerschaften mit Ländern
Leinecker,
des globalen Südens
the main
eins,
interest
das
in
Interesse
strategic
an
partnerships
Emissionshandel oder zwei,
are
Kompensationsgeschäfte
concentrated on
und
the
dann
emission trade
fragt
or on
Imogen
compensation
auf Englisch, und ich
trade.
lese
And
das dann nochmal
Imogen
auf
Outlaw
Deutsch vor,
asks,
oder die
I will
Dolmetscherin
read it.
müsst ihr jetzt, nee, müsst ihr doch.
Yeah.
Also sie fragt,
So she
wie ist
asks,
denn eure Perspektive
what is your
auf den
perspective
Plan, auch jetzt beim Emissionshandel,
on the
Klimaziel
plan of
sozusagen
emission
wird für
trade
internationale
and the
Emissionszertifikate
objective of
den
2040 for
nationalen
international
Klimazielen eben zuzurechnen? Es gibt eine relativ große Diskussion
pollution
in der neuen
certificates.
Bundesregierung hat sich da
There's a
auch
huge
ihre Haltung
debate
verändert,
going
ist
on,
dann
and the
eher
federal government
dafür, als
also
es noch
changed its
die
position,
Regierung war.
and
Also etwas, also
it
ist ja eine
was
Verwässerung und eine
in
Auslagerung der
favor
Verantwortlichkeit, die
during the
einzelnen
time of
Institutionen
the traffic light
übernehmen. Also vielleicht diese
government,
Kombination aus
but
Fragen
there
von
seems to
Wolfgang
be
und
a
schon zur
watering
Frage,
down. So these two
woran haben denn
questions
die
would
strategischen Partnerschaften
should
jetzt
be
im Süden
answered.
darüber hinaus wirklich das Interesse
What is the
was
real
wie läuft
interest
das mit
of
den
those
internationalen
strategic
Emissionszertifikaten? Wie
partnerships, and
seht ihr
how do you
Vorschläge?
see
Vielleicht
the
mit
ideas
Ina
about
anfangen und
the
dann Claudia und dann auch noch mal
international certificates, CO2 certificates?
Ja, also ich denke, das ist etwas, das habe ich vorhin jetzt nicht genannt, aber als ich den Koalitionsvertrag gelesen habe, da ist mir das auch aufgefallen.
But I also noticed it when I read the coalition agreement.
Es ist wichtig, mit Ländern zu kooperieren,
it's
dann, weil man
important,
eben
of course,
also
to cooperate with countries because you want trustworthy partners
Gewissens abkaufen kann, um selber
to buy these emission certificates
schwächt man damit natürlich den Klimaschutz.
But of course, globally, you're weakening climate protection
da bin ich
when you
auf
do
der
this.
Seite der Kritiker, dass das
I
schwierig ist.
would join those who criticize that and say it's a difficult concept.
Also ich denke, dass eine ernsthafte Partnerschaft, die eben auf Klimapolitik international einzahlen soll,
and the basis of climate protection should be leading to a real transformation.
Also welche Art von Zertifikaten?
Because it also depends on the type of certificate that's going to be traded.
Eher skeptisch.
I'm quite skeptical as to that.
Ihr anderen zu dem Thema, will noch jemand was?
How about the others? Would you like to speak to that?
Ich musste ein bisschen schmunzeln, weil ich dachte schon natürlich, dass dieses Thema jetzt auch kommt, weil es einfach
It made me smile. I did expect this topic because it's been discussed this week anyways.
Dann auch der geänderten politischen Großwetterlage
So, of course, the political weather in Europe has changed, as we know, and in Brussels, but also in civil society. Now, we hear
jetzt aber eben weiterhin den Klimazielen, den EU-Klimazielen hier auch
it's a good thing
verschreibt.
that Germany sticks to those climate goals and supports them, because of course they're being put in doubt now.
die Regierung aus Deutschland sagt jetzt, sie unterstützt das weiter.
If the German government continues to support it, that's a positive. I understand the disquiet, but most observers believe that it's best to wait and see.
Dann auch sowas natürlich da auch als ein Kriterien mit aufgeführt wird und ja auch dann erstmals wie jetzt eben zertifiziert.
It's also being quoted as a criterion, and
dann dazu auch zu sagen, okay, dann hast du damit halt wenigstens auch schon mal
I think I also heard that well, at least you have high standards that you've set this way, and that could also mean leading by example.
Dann in früheren Jahren aus vergleichbaren
Not by the example that we used to have in previous years and similar mechanisms. So when you mean leading by example in terms of the global emissions trade, no. Well, the clean development mechanism and how that worked. So the things that were decided here and the things that we're aiming at now are at a higher level. At least there's that. So I would join the critics here without having analyzed detail. But there are a couple of points that are important. So it's doubtful in terms of the Paris climate agreement. Everyone had agreed to make the maximum effort for climate mitigation, so it doesn't really fit. And then you usually have the cheaper climate measures in the partner countries with these certificates. So reaching national goals and objectives of climate goals in the partner countries would become more difficult. The low-hanging fruit would already be gone. So if you want a climate transition and you cannot reduce emissions at home, then of course that negatively affects the credibility of international climate diplomacy. So we already see projects with different partnerships, organizations approach us with their questions. So I think there are a lot of questions and there is a lot of disquiet and doubts about this already, which is difficult for such partnerships. Thank you. We have 5 minutes, and I would like to finish the usual way, almost. So you're all think tankers, more or less, closer or less close to political parties. So my question to you, it's an easy question to politicians, but you're not politicians. So looking at Gabriele, and she said, I'm speechless, and other critics, people who disagree. And you all have slightly different viewpoints, but more or less, you all said, yeah, we need more for climate protection and climate foreign policy. So the details could be discussed, but you did have some common ground here. So when Gabriele and others said, I'm speechless, and somebody else said, how can we make it so that these great impulses from your policy brief are going to be implemented as a civil society, as citizens? How can we make these points heard at the decision-making level? So how can we make ourselves heard if we're not happy with the status quo? How can we achieve that? What can the audience do specifically? So I'm going to start with Imme from the back. Well,
auf die Straße gehen.
Demonstrate, participate in demonstrations.
Ich hatte das ja gesagt, also diese fehlende Verankerung von Klimapolitik
already mentioned it. The fact that climate political goals have not found a part in the economic strategy and goals is rather frustrating.
Das müssen wir alle aufmerksam beobachten.
And we all have to keep an eye on this, a close eye, and then raise our voice.
Handeln in der notwendigen Entschiedenheit und ja auch Radikalität einfordern.
And demand the decisiveness and the radical action that is necessary, otherwise it doesn't have a future. Claudia?
Well,
I think I already mentioned it. These questions regarding the international level, we can just keep talking about it with our own, in our own environment. Everyone has their opinions, and that can also influence the general public opinion. If we say to everyone, we know that this is in our interest and this will benefit everyone to have these ambitious partnerships. And of course, positive examples will also have an effect. Last year, we published a survey with 19 countries with the reaction of the population to the climate transformation. What are the barriers? What are the no-goes? Higher prices were not very popular, for instance, but there are also positive examples from close by, just around the corner. So we can see, they switched and their electricity consumption is lower, or heat supply is no longer gas-based. So let's not forget how important these things can have on our everyday life. So let's talk about the positive things. So not always not just angry remarks about our heat pumps. Lukas and
Ja, ich mache es mir einfach und sage, es braucht irgendwie einen Mix und
I'm too quick.
Immer an, es braucht die kritischen Stimmen.
We need the critics, the loud raised voices, the people who will demonstrate, look at their own consumptions. But we also need a constructive dialogue. It's not enough to just point our fingers. So if we have a government that's ready to participate in a constructive dialogue, well, we've tried to do that with our policy brief, and then we can be successful with a mix of these different channels and different communication strategies.
Ich würde vielleicht noch dazu sagen,
let me add that I believe that it's very important for political actors to keep in mind the aspect of justice and fairness in climate protection. And I've also seen that in the comments that we have to involve the public in these discussions, especially in the Global South, in order to make sure what type of transformation we can have. Well, that's an important point. I wanted to also make that point. Johannes Hilde has written a book, and I would like to recommend it. And he talked about democratic emotionalization and climate policy. And he said that this aspect of fairness, very few people profit, and the majority who didn't benefit have to suffer now. So people who are very close to the AfD and very right-wing will have an emotional reaction nonetheless to this kind of pointing out these unfair aspects. So Ines, you mentioned this topic of fairness and the impression that something isn't fair. That way, I think we can even reach people who are not that close to the Green Party or the SPD, but more at the center, or even on the right wing. So that's something that can give us hope, because it shows that we can even reach people who we maybe believe it's not even worth talking about it within. You just have to know how to go about it. That's all. And I hope we can contribute to that today on the 25th of June, we have Ebenhofer, who's the father of the emissions trade, and some others for a discussion. And we're going to talk about the international aspect in emission trade, have some background on that because we only talked about this briefly today. So we're going to talk about this aspect of fairness and unfairness in order to reach the majority of possible people. Thank you to everyone and also the interpreters. Well, thank you to our audience and our speakers, and enjoy your evening. And of course, the long weekend that we have ahead now. Bye bye.
Dankeschön.
Danke.
Tschüss.
Vielen Dank. Ciao.